Imagine devoting your entire life to just ICO only to discover that the system you swore to protect is built on lies. Imagine watching a man rot behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, while the real criminals walk free. This isn't just a story about betrayal, corruption, and broken faith. A broken bar. It's about two people who dared to challenge the darkness, and in doing so, uncovered a truth that could either save lives or destroy them. Dear viewers, imagine for a moment that everything you believed about yourself, about your purpose, about your values, could be tested by a single choice. What would you do if someone asked you to risk everything you had worked for, everything you had built, to help them? Would you say no and protect yourself, or would you say yes, knowing that the decision might cost you your career, your freedom, maybe even your identity? Today's story is about a young female police officer from Texas whose entire world changed the moment she received an impossible request from behind prison walls. This is not simply a story about bending rules or breaking protocols. This is about integrity, justice, compassion, and a decision that would transform two lives forever. I invite you to stay with me until the very end, because this journey is full of twists you won't see coming. And the deeper you go, the more you'll find yourself asking, what would I have done in her place? Our story begins with Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old officer whose career seemed destined for success. Rebecca was not just another cop wearing a badge. She was the kind of person who took her oath seriously. Growing up in a small Texas town, Rebecca's earliest memories were shaped by her father, a sheriff's deputy for over 20 years. She remembered the nights he came home late, uniform dusty, eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with pride. He told her again and again that being an officer wasn't about power, it wasn't about authority, it wasn't even about chasing criminals. It was about being a protector, about standing as the barrier between chaos and order, about serving those who couldn't defend themselves. Most of all, he taught her that an officer's most important weapon wasn't their gun or badge, it was their integrity. Rebecca carried those lessons like scripture. When she graduated from the police academy with top honors, it didn't surprise anyone who knew her. Her instructors said she had a natural ability to de-escalate tense situations. She had patience, clarity, and a quiet confidence that made people listen. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't aggressive, but she was effective. Her first years on the force in Dallas were full of the usual calls to traffic stops, domestic disputes, burglary reports, but she handled each one with consistency and fairness. Her supervisors quickly noticed her professionalism, and other officers requested to work with her because they knew she had their backs. But being someone who followed every rule also meant she sometimes stood out in ways that weren't welcome. When she saw corners being cut on reports, she spoke up. When she noticed questionable behavior, she reported it. When others turned a blind eye, she refused. This earned her respect from some, but resentment from others. And resentment in the police department can be a dangerous thing. The conflict came to a head with Captain Williams, a man in his 50s with a reputation for getting his way. Williams had been in the department for decades, and with his seniority came influence, connections, and a belief that he was untouchable. At first, his interactions with Rebecca were professional, even friendly, but soon they turned into something else. He began making subtle comments, inappropriate suggestions, and then, bolder advances. Rebecca tried to keep it professional, politely but firmly making her boundaries clear, but Williams didn't take rejection well. What started as uncomfortable conversations turned into retaliation. Suddenly, Rebecca was being assigned the worst shifts, sent on the most dangerous calls, and having her reports questioned in front of peers. The pressure mounted until one evening, Williams called her into his office. What began as a discussion about routine assignments turned into something darker. He leaned across his desk, voice low but sharp, making it clear that her career advancement depended on being more cooperative with him. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief, and when she told him she would not tolerate his behavior and would report him if necessary, he leaned back with a cold smile and said, "You're making a big mistake." 2 weeks later, Rebecca received her transfer orders. She was being reassigned to a maximum security correctional facility 3 hours outside Dallas. The official explanation cited staffing shortages, but Rebecca knew the truth. Williams had pulled strings to bury her, to punish her for standing up to him. Instead of fighting the transfer and risking more damage to her career, Rebecca accepted it with dignity. She told herself she would adapt. Law enforcement was her calling, no matter the environment. But when she walked through the heavy steel doors of the prison for the first time, the atmosphere hit her like a physical weight. The air was thicker, the noise sharper, the tension ever present. Unlike the police station, this place wasn't about community service. It was about survival, order, and control in a place where hope often went to die. Her job was to supervise inmates, escort them to activities, and enforce security protocols. She quickly learned that working in corrections was different from working on the streets. Here, authority was delicate. Too soft and the inmates would walk over you. Too harsh and you could spark violence. You had to understand unspoken rules, read faces, sense moods, and maintain authority without igniting unnecessary conflict. Most inmates fell into familiar categories as the ones who rebelled against every rule, the broken ones who had given up, the manipulators who played games, the quiet ones just trying to make it through. Rebecca treated them all with the same respect she'd shown as a cop. She believed even in prison, dignity mattered. But one inmate stood out. His name was David Chen. He was serving a 15-year sentence for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Unlike others, David carried himself differently. He was polite, respectful, and never caused problems. He spent most of his time in the library, reading or helping other inmates write letters and legal documents. Guards liked him because he stayed out of trouble. Inmates respected him because he offered help without demanding favors. Rebecca first noticed him during meal supervision. While others were loud, disruptive, or withdrawn, David sat quietly, reading or writing. He never crossed boundaries, never tried to manipulate her, never played the games inmates often did. But she noticed something in his eyes, a deep sadness, a weight that seemed heavier than prison itself. Over time, she noticed more. During yard time, he sometimes stared through the fences at the horizon, expression filled with longing and regret. During mail call, his name was never called. He never had visitors. He was isolated, yet carried himself with quiet dignity. One evening, Rebecca saw him in the common area staring at a photograph. When he noticed her, he quickly tucked it away, but she caught a glimpse of what looked like a family picture. That image lingered in her mind. Weeks later, during a routine cell inspection, Rebecca discovered a hidden folder among David's belongings. It wasn't contraband in the usual sense, no weapons, no drugs, but it was unusual. It contained documents, letters, and what looked like evidence related to his case. She confronted him, expecting excuses, but his response shook her. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said, "I didn't do what they say I did. I was framed, and before I lose hope completely, I need someone to help me prove it. Not for me, for my daughter." Rebecca froze. Officers were trained to shut down manipulations, and inmates claiming innocence was the oldest story in the book. But there was something about the way David spoke. He was steady, calm, yet filled with quiet desperation that made her hesitate. He told her about his daughter, Emma. She had been just 8 years old when he was arrested, battling leukemia. During his trial, while lawyers argued and paperwork piled up, Emma's health declined. He promised her during one hospital visit that he would prove his innocence and one day take her to see the ocean. But 6 months into his sentence, Emma passed away. He never got to say goodbye, never fulfilled that promise. The guilt consumed him. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that getting involved would be dangerous, career suicide. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the grief in David's face when he spoke of Emma. The next day, against every instinct as an officer, Rebecca drove to a public library and started researching his case. What she found disturbed her. The trial had been rushed. Witnesses had recanted later. The company David worked for had been investigated for multiple violations, but the cases were quietly dropped. Patterns of corruption emerged, painting a picture that David might truly have been framed. Rebecca's days off turned into investigative missions. She contacted journalists, reached out to former employees, and pieced together a disturbing story of corporate fraud, cover-ups, and legal manipulation. Each discovery convinced her further that David was telling the truth, but she also knew the risk. If she was wrong, she would lose her job, her freedom, everything. 3 months into her investigation, a breakthrough arrived. A former company executive, dying of cancer, reached out to a reporter with evidence via financial records, emails, recordings of that proved David had been framed. Senior management had orchestrated the fraud and pinned it on him. The executive confessed to falsifying documents under pressure. Rebecca now faced a choice. She could go through official channels, which would take years, or she could act decisively. She chose the latter. Working with the journalist and the executive, she coordinated the release of the evidence to multiple news outlets. She documented David's behavior in prison, gathered statements from inmates and guards, and built a case impossible to ignore. The story broke wide. By evening, David's case was front-page news. Executives were arrested, officials investigated, and the legal system scrambled to respond. For David, hope returned. But for Rebecca, the danger grew. Prison officials launched an investigation into how sensitive information had leaked. Suspicion circled, and Rebecca knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered her role. The night before David's conviction was overturned, he requested to see Rebecca in the prison chapel. In the quiet, he thanked her, but then asked something more. He wanted to fulfill Emma's memory by creating a foundation to help children battling cancer, especially those whose parents faced legal or financial hardships. He asked her to help him build it. Rebecca saw in his eyes not just gratitude, but purpose. Here was a man who had lost everything: his daughter, his freedom, his reputation, and yet he wanted to use his pain to help others. She realized this wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about transformation. When David walked out of prison a free man, Rebecca's own life shifted. She resigned from her job, knowing she couldn't go back. Even her warden, a fair man, admitted he knew what she had done, and though he couldn't condone it, he respected her integrity. Together, Rebecca and David launched the Emma Chan Foundation. Their first case was a single mother, Maria Santos, drowning in medical bills while her son fought cancer. Rebecca sat with her, helped her organize paperwork, brought groceries, and reassured her that she wasn't alone. Watching the boy smile despite his illness, Rebecca knew she was on the right path. Over months, the foundation grew. They partnered with hospitals, lawyers, and volunteers. David worked tirelessly, sometimes too much, channeling grief into purpose. Rebecca worried about him, but also admired his strength. They were no longer officer and inmate. They were partners in a mission larger than themselves. But challenges came. Former enemies resurfaced, questioning Rebecca's ethics, calling her a traitor. Donations slowed at times, forcing them to make hard choices. Rebecca received anonymous threats warning her to stop digging into past corporate corruption. The road was far from easy. Yet, for every obstacle, there was a story of hope. A child's treatment funded, a family saved from bankruptcy, a parent given the strength to keep fighting. These victories fueled them both. Rebecca often thought back to the moment in David's cell when he asked for help. It felt like a lifetime ago. She realized her father had been right all along. Integrity wasn't about following rules blindly. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. And so, their journey continued, and not just the story of the wrongfully convicted man and the officer who believed him, but of two people who turned pain into purpose, who refused to let injustice have the last word. Together, they proved that sometimes, the most dangerous request is also the one that leads to redemption. The months that followed the Foundation's official launch were some of the hardest and most inspiring days of Rebecca's life. On paper, things looked promising. They had press coverage from David's release, attention from community leaders, and a small but loyal group of donors. But behind the scenes, the reality was grueling. Setting up a nonprofit wasn't as simple as filing paperwork and opening a bank account. Every day brought new hurdles: legal requirements, financial reporting, compliance issues that Rebecca hadn't even known existed. David threw himself into the work with obsessive energy, sometimes working 18 hours straight, poring over grant applications, replying to emails, or calling hospitals to negotiate partnerships. Rebecca often found him at 3 in the morning, hunched over his laptop in their modest office space, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered documents. His grief was still a raw wound, and she realized he was keeping it at bay by drowning himself in purpose. One evening, Rebecca gently placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "David, you can't burn yourself out like this. Emma wouldn't want you to." He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot but resolute, and whispered, "I don't get tired when I think about her. I only get tired when I think about stopping." Rebecca didn't argue further. She understood that grief doesn't follow rules. But not everyone celebrated their mission. Anonymous emails began arriving, some dismissive, others threatening. "Stop digging into the past." One message read, "If you think you've won, you haven't. Walk away while you can." Another arrived with a chilling warning, "The people who put you away once can do it again." At first, Rebecca thought the threats were empty, but then she noticed a black SUV parked across from her apartment 2 nights in a row. When she walked to her car, the driver started the engine but didn't move until she pulled away. David admitted he had been receiving similar signs and unanswered calls from blocked numbers, envelopes slipped under his door with no return address. Instead of frightening them into silence, the intimidation only fueled their determination. Rebecca knew the corruption that framed David was bigger than just one company. Powerful people had been involved, people who didn't want the truth exposed, and now that she had stepped into this fight, she couldn't back down. At the same time, the foundation was transforming lives. Maria Santos, the single mother they first helped, sent them a letter months later. Carlos's treatments were progressing, and for the first time in years, she felt hope. She wrote, "You didn't just help me pay bills, you gave me my son back, you gave me strength to keep going." Reading those words brought Rebecca to tears. The foundation's work began attracting national attention. A well-known journalist profiled their efforts, highlighting how they weren't just funding treatments, but also helping families navigate the legal system when a parent was incarcerated. This unique mission resonated deeply with people who felt overlooked by traditional charities. Donations grew, hospitals reached out, even former skeptics in the legal world began supporting them. But success came at a price. David's past was constantly dragged up in interviews. Reporters loved the redemption angle but never failed to remind audiences that he had once been labeled a criminal. Some parents hesitated to accept help from a man who had been in prison, even after his exoneration. Rebecca often stepped in to reassure them, using her credibility as a former officer to bridge the gap. Their bond deepened through these trials. Late nights spent planning turned into quiet conversations about their pasts, their regrets, their hopes. Rebecca shared stories about her father, about how his unwavering integrity had shaped her life. David spoke of Emma, recounting small details of how she laughed at the silliest cartoons, how she loved drawing pictures of the sea she never got to see. Each story stitched them closer together. But Rebecca also struggled with her own sacrifices. Leaving her career hadn't been easy. Sometimes she woke up missing the uniform, the structure, the sense of belonging. Other times, she felt the sting of betrayal from colleagues who now viewed her as a traitor. Yet, when she saw the families they helped, when she saw David standing in front of a group of volunteers, speaking with passion about turning pain into purpose, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The turning point came when the foundation received a call from a federal prosecutor. The corruption case tied to David's old company had expanded, revealing a web of crimes spanning multiple states. The prosecutor wanted David and Rebecca's help in his testimony, her investigative skills. This was no longer just about clearing David's name. It was about dismantling an entire network of fraud that had ruined countless lives. Rebecca hesitated. Getting involved meant putting themselves directly in the crosshairs of dangerous people, but David was resolute. "If we don't fight this, more families will suffer. More Emmas will lose their chance to see the ocean." His words left no room for retreat. Together, they stepped back into the storm, not as officer and inmate, not even as victim and rescuer, but as partners bound by a mission greater than themselves. And as the walls of corruption began to crumble, Rebecca realized something she had never expected. The impossible request David once made in that prison cell of the one that could have destroyed her had instead given her life a new meaning she never knew she was missing. And their story was only just beginning.